Welcome back to another instalment of New Zealand Bird of the Week, where in this video I will be talking about the moa, a group of birds which were some of the most derived and interesting birds that have ever existed. I hope you enjoy. Moa were a group of 9 species of bird within 6 genera in 3 families that inhabited the islands of New Zealand until fairly recently, and some of the birds were likely among the tallest that have ever existed. They were highly derived animals and possessed numerous anatomical differences that made them truly unique organisms, thriving on their island homes until they were swiftly wiped out at the hands of humans. This is the story of the moa. For a start, what the moa are closest related to and even how they arrived in New Zealand has been a source of debate. It was long since believed that moa and kiwi were closely related alongside the Australian emu and cassowary, given their proximity to one another, and became isolated on New Zealand after the landmass of Gondwana had begun to separate. But through recent genetic examination, it has instead been found that moa and kiwi are quite distinct. It was found that kiwi were in fact most closely related to the elephant birds of Madagascar, which indicates that ratites, the group of which the moa and these birds belong to, independently evolved flightlessness as they colonised land masses, resulting in independently evolved flightless populations, of which some maintained some semblance of wings, while others lost them altogether. It was also found that the order containing moa, the Deinonythiformes, were actually sister taxa to the order containing the South American tinamou, and that the common ancestor of the two groups diverged around 60 million years ago. Having arrived in New Zealand, these ancestral birds had to adapt with a dynamic geological landscape, a country positioned between 2 active fault lines that continuously altered the landscape, which led to the complex lineage of moa that we know of. The Southern Alps, the mountain chain formed around 6 million years ago, and the habitat change and fragmentation on both islands as a result, including increased volcanism and landscape changes. From this, moa, while already having diverged since the Miocene, went through their largest radiation, from which all named moa species evolved to fill in the niches vacant in the country. From subalpine to temperate forest, moa thrived in these unique and varied environments, and due to their radiation, allowed for niche partitioning to take place, meaning that all of these remarkable birds could coexist. In terms of the biology and anatomy of moa, they are well known for multiple complete skeletons, as well as remarkable soft tissue remains which have preserved skin, feathers, muscle tissue, and even organs due to their recent extinction. Moa were comparable in many aspects to other ratites, including a small head positioned on the long neck, a rigid torso, long legs, and a covering of fur-like feathers. In many aspects though, moa were very unique birds with a number of characteristics that are not seen in any known birds. For as long as moa have been known to science, most skeletal mounts and artistic portrayals, whether they be paintings or sculptures, have depicted the birds with an ostrich-like posture, which displays the full height of the largest of birds. Recent examination of moa vertebral and cranial anatomy suggests a different posture, that the birds would have carried their heads in a lowered position when at rest, and in a curved position so that the head is level to the back. Kiwi and cassowaries, as well as many non-avian dinosaurs, adopt or adopted a similar posture, which in these organisms allows for more efficient travel through dense forest. This isn't to say that moa were incapable of raising their necks into an erect posture, as they have been depicted in Maori rock art with fully extended necks, which was more impressive to the artists of the time, although from a biological aspect, they would have only adopted this posture when actively browsing, threat displaying, or when surveying their surroundings. Moa legs were also generally longer and more robust than other ratites, with particularly elongated tibotarsica and shortened tarsometatarsus. The feet were also large and broad, with most species possessing 4 toes, with the 4th toe being small and often just a spur on the leg. These limb proportions, with their shortened distal segments, suggest that they were not built for active running like ostriches or emu, and that while they could be fast when they needed to, their legs were more manoeuvrable than their relatives, with their sturdy legs and shorter foot bones making them more able at weaving through trees and other obstacles when evading aerial predators like the Haast's eagle. As well as this, moa also seem to have taken their flightlessness to a level unparalleled to that of any other flightless birds, in that they uniquely lack any forelimbs due to the absence of the TBX5 gene, the gene responsible for forming the pectoral girdle. As a result, the sole remnant of the forelimb in the skeleton is a tiny vestige of bone known as the scapular coracoid, a unique feature possessed only by the moa, which lies against the rib cage and is no larger than a human finger, indicating that there was no useful function in possessing forelimbs in these birds. The internal anatomy of moa is largely unknown due to them being extinct, but as their extinction was so recent, it means that remarkable insights can still be gathered about their anatomy and even the sounds they would have made. Brilliantly preserved specimens of the eastern and stout-legged moa were found with ossified tracheal rings within their body cavities, revealing the form and structure of the windpipe. These remarkable discoveries show that these two species, and potentially the bush moa, possessed a convoluted windpipe. From the neck, the windpipe passes downwards on the left side of the body before doubling back in on itself and then backward into the lungs, with the organ being far longer than their necks. Modern birds that possess this feature, such as cranes and swans, are known for producing deep, resonant vocalizations, which implies that moa were highly vocal animals that could produce a broad range of situation-specific calls, which would have been heard over great distances, from contact calls, alarm calls, to mating calls. This gives valuable insight into not only the sounds these animals would have been able to make, but in the case of these two moa, allows for a clearer picture of their behaviour and social structure, which will be covered once I discuss all the different moa species in detail. Moa beaks and skulls are typically larger and broader than compared to other ratites, enabling a wider variety of plant material to be eaten. The orbits were large, and the nostrils were located at the base of the beak, having an exceptionally well-developed sense of smell as indicated by large olfactory lobes, a feature that is also shared with kiwi. This enhanced ability to process odours suggests that chemical communication was an important aspect of locating other moa, which would have been an important aspect of moa behaviour. The bills of moa varied greatly among the group, from robust, sharp and pointed to snip branches and flax, to weaker, rounded ones more suited to plucking soft leaves and fruit. This diversity of beak shape, as well as differing heights and stomach structure, allowed these birds to coexist within their own separate niches, feeding on different plant species, different parts of the same plant, or in different seasons. This leads in nicely to the next part of the video, in which I will be discussing the remarkable menagerie of moa and all the species the group contains. Moa taxonomy, and even how many species of moa used to exist, has been until quite recently convoluted. Since the first description of moa by the now infamous Sir Richard Owen, the taxonomy of moa has been in constant review, with as many as 64 species in 20 genera proposed over the past 170 years, which has since been narrowed down to the present consensus of 9 species. Even in such a fairly small country like New Zealand, the diversity of these large birds is truly remarkable, and some of the most imposing belong to the family known as Dinornithidae. The South Island giant moa, Dinornis robustus, was the largest of the group, with the largest birds standing up to 2 meters tall at the shoulder and being able to reach foliage an astonishing 3.6 meters off of the ground, making them the tallest bird species known. Birds would have ranged widely throughout the South Island in all vegetated habitats, from coastal dunes to inland shrublands, forests, and subalpine herb fields. Because of their height, they were able to reach vegetation that no other moa species on the island could reach, filling the niche of giraffes in the country. Utilising their long necks to reach into trees, they would then utilise their small, broad, flattened heads and robust and slightly decurved bill to pull down plant material, whether they be twigs, whole branches, shrubs, or berries and flowers. Compared to other species of moa, These birds were more lightly built compared to their relatives, and although often 4 times heavier than other moa, their bones were comparatively thinner and less robust, meaning that despite their large size at around 200 kilograms, they would have been quite agile, but also less resilient to impacts on their legs, meaning that they would have led a less active lifestyle than their smaller but more sturdily built relatives. Plumage is also known in these birds, and it has been found that like many New Zealand birds, they were more dull in coloration, possessing long reddish-brown hair-like feathers up to 18 centimeters in length across the body except on their lower legs. In terms of their nesting, it has been found that South Island giant moa utilise rocks or hollow trees as shelter for their eggs, which once a good spot was found, they were likely reused over many years, indicating that they bred as isolated pairs rather than in colonies, building up fat reserves in summer while guarding the nest in autumn, which can be inferred from emu that exist in a similar latitude to the moa. Constructing the nest out of twigs and other plant materials, a single or potentially 2 white eggs would be laid in a shallow bed of plant materials. The extremely large eggs would have weighed an estimated 4 kilograms when fresh, and likely had an incubation period of longer than 2 months. As in other ratites, once the egg has been laid, the male would have incubated the most fragile egg of any avian, being a remarkably thin 1.4 millimeters despite being the size of a rugby ball. To avoid crushing the egg, the male bird, instead of sitting on the nest, would likely have instead wrapped their long necks around the nest for warmth, without the risk of a potential breaking, all the while eating very little. This example of breeding and chick rearing is known as reversed sexual dimorphism, which in these birds was taken to an extreme level and on a scale unprecedented in either birds or mammals anywhere else on Earth. The difference in size being so remarkably different that the 2 sexes were once classed as different species. Female birds were 150% taller than their male counterparts, and an astonishing 280% heavier. Like modern birds, which demonstrate such high degrees of female-biased sexual dimorphism, female birds were likely to have mated with multiple males within their home ranges, and would have competed aggressively for the males with the best presented territories and the most impressive vocalizations. Once the egg had been laid, the female would wander off and potentially not even return until the following breeding season, with the male raising the chick on their own. Because of the huge size of the egg, the contents of the yolk would have provided enough energy for moa chicks to develop and grow for a long time. This meant that as soon as the chick hatched in spring, they would have been precocial, being able to see, run and feed themselves immediately. They would have had then bonded to their parents, following them for at least a year until they were large enough to fend for themselves. No plumage from a moa chick has ever been found, although given the coloration possessed by other hatchling ratites, it is likely that they were speckled or striped to break up their outline in order to camouflage themselves from hungry eagles and harriers. From studies into the growth of moa from their lower leg bones, it was found that juvenile giant moa, although just a year old, already were at least 16 kilograms in weight, already making them heavier than any flying bird today. By the time they reached their full size a few years later, they would have weighed 15 times as much. Like juvenile ostriches in Africa, young moa may have supplemented their diet with lizards, insects, frogs and other organisms to fuel their rapidly increasing weight. It is thought that these moa reached sexual maturity after a few years, but their social behaviours would have prevented them from actually entering the breeding pool until they were much older. Territorial birds such as cassowary do not breed until they are dominant enough to claim their own territory and mate, which in the case of moa meant that they may have had to wait up to 10 years until they could establish a territory and have a chance to mate. The large females could have lived for over half a century, producing an egg or 2 every season, and from what can be gathered from skeletons preserved in regions like Pyramid Valley and Bell Hill Vineyard, 80% of the birds were adults, indicating that populations comprised of mostly long-lived, slow-breeding adults, and as will be discussed later, was a strategy that would ultimately fail as humans appeared on the scene. The North Island's giant moa was quite similar to their South Island counterparts, although they differed from them in that they were half a metre smaller in total height, had a relatively longer, weaker neck, and a more down-curved beak. The high level of sexual dimorphism is also present in this species, although with female birds being slightly smaller and males being the same size as those on the South Island. They were a little closer in size, but were still noticeably different. Size also varied depending on their wide range of habitats, as lowland populations in shrubland tended to be larger than the upland populations in closed forest. Quite the contrary to the large members of Dinornithidae, the aptly named little bush moa was one of the most common and widespread of the moa group, inhabiting the closed canopy lowland forests throughout the country. Birds were slender animals with long legs adapted for speed and agility, therefore making them the smallest moa in terms of mass, weighing at most 30 kilograms, and being 75 centimeters tall at the hips. Like the larger Dinornithidae, birds would have nested on the ground or in rock shelters, and from field research and DNA, it was likely that birds bred in solitary pairs, and as they were more mobile like members of Dinornithidae, they were more solitary, and therefore had the broadest range across New Zealand, able to survive in many different environments, from the heavily forested areas of the west coast to the subalpine hills of the east. From their size, they likely would have taken a very slow 8 years to reach adult size and skeletal maturity, which like the giant moa would have also been the time when they would have been able to mate. In terms of diet, little bush moa possessed a relatively short, sharp-edged bill, which indicates that they were more suited to cutting than compared to other moa species. This attribute, coupled with the large number of gastroliths found in the bird's gizzard and coprolites, suggests that they browsed on a wide variety of woody, fibrous plants and other tough plant materials, with a biomechanical study confirming that bush moa fed using a unilateral clipping action. Much of these birds' appearance is well known from well-preserved remains, including a partially articulated skeleton that was preserved with substantial mummified material, revealing that this species was covered in yellowish-brown to pale-coloured feathers, which measured up in length. Heavy-footed moa were very bulky moa that were restricted to the South Island, where they were common in lowland forest, shrubland edges and wetlands. As their name suggests, the heavy-footed moa were an exceptionally bulky species, and were the largest moa relative to their size, as well as being the third largest species overall, standing about 120 centimeters tall at the hips and weighing about 163 kilograms, being so strangely proportioned that their describer, Heinrich Harder, characterized them as absurd looking. Birds had relatively short and sturdy legs, which were supported by massive feet, and in turn supported their almost spherical bodies. Study of feathers from mummified remains suggests that heavy-footed moa had a speckled pattern similar to the little spotted kiwi, as well as other feathers that were plain or slightly streaked. Like a woolly elephant, their large bulky bodies would have helped them bulldoze vegetation, and their large size and shaggy feathers would have helped them cope with cold temperatures. A large olfactory chamber suggests that they had an acute sense of smell, which may have been useful for species recognition as well as potentially being an adaptation for a nocturnal lifestyle. Birds possessed a round head and a long and sturdy decurved bill with a pointed beak. This more powerfully built beak was adapted to handle tougher vegetation, such as wood, herbaceous plants and flax, and from discovered coprolites, it was found that this species hosted several types of taxa-specific parasites, like nematodes. The altitudinal limit for this species appears to have been 700 meters above sea level, as no fossils for them have been found as of yet above this point. Birds underwent significant changes in relative abundance and distribution in response to environmental changes during the late Pleistocene and Holocene. Climatic and environmental fluctuations during glacial cycles caused their preferred habitats to expand and contract repeatedly, resulting in two genetically distinct populations forming in the northern and southern halves of the South Island. Contrasting to their giant size, they are also notable on a far smaller scale, in that they are the only moa species to have moa embryos attributed to them, giving some insight into their developmental stages. The smallest of the three moa species in the genus Pachyornis, to which the previously discussed heavy-footed moa belongs to, the Mantell's moa, being named after New Zealand naturalist and politician Walter Mantell, the son of paleontologist Gideon Mantell, was confined to the North Island. The largest of birds weighed around 36 kilograms, which is just slightly heavier than the slimmer bush moa, of which the Mantell's moa is the second smallest moa species in the country. The sturdy bill, like the heavy-footed moa, also meant that they may have had a fibrous diet. The crested moa was a large, thick-set bird with robust legs, and while not as robust as the massive heavy-footed moa, was still a large bird at around 90 kilograms in weight. Crested moa were confined to the South Island and mainly inhabited subalpine shrublands and grasslands of 800 metres above sea level. The birds were named as such due to the possibility that they would have been the only moa species considered to have had crest feathers, which would have grown from distinctive small feather pits on the front half of the top of the skull, which may have been utilised for courtship displays. These cranial pits are also occasionally found in Dinornis, Anomalopteryx and other Pachyornis species, although they were not as numerous as in the crested moa. Unfortunately, little else is known about this species of moa, as they had a relatively small and inaccessible habitat, and as such, even the proposed feathers the bird was named after have as of yet never been found, so their coloration and size is unknown. These birds were highly elusive and are therefore poorly known. It was even considered that until recently, the species had become extinct around 10,000 years ago, during a period of significant climate upheaval. The youngest verified remains have been dated around this time, and this moa, besides already being the rarest and least understood of the 9 species, was also the only species to have never been found in human archaeological sites. Then, in 2012, a specimen was found in the entrance to the Borma cave system on Mount Owen in Nelson that proved that their time of extinction was actually the complete opposite of what was previously thought. The specimen was radiocarbon dated at being around 560 years old, meaning that the bird must have died between the years 1396 and 1442, just 2 centuries before Abel Tasman's expedition reached the west coast of what would be named New Zealand. This discovery meant that rather than the first moa to vanish from New Zealand, they were likely the last, and given their remote habitat, would have been inaccessible to hunters, meaning that they may have survived for quite a while after their relatives went extinct, as we'll get into. Stout-legged moa were a short-legged, bulky moa that was one of the most widespread species that varied in size over the length of the country, typically weighing around 109 kilograms for the female birds, with the male birds being comparable in size to turkeys. Birds lived in the vegetation mosaic of grassland, shrubland forest found in the dry regions of the North and South Islands, especially in Canterbury and Otago, and with their blunt and relatively weak beaks, they would have browsed on a variety of soft herbs, shrubs, and fruits. Like the eastern moa, these birds possessed a long and convoluted windpipe to assist in far-off communication, producing low-frequency sounds likely similar to that of cassowary. The eastern moa was a common species found in the eastern South Island, being considered distinct enough to be placed in its own genus, Emus. Like the similar but larger stout-legged moa, they had a relatively small head with a delicately pointed, decurved bill, indicating that they fed on soft leaves and fruit, being around 80 kilograms in weight. Birds have been found across the eastern South Island, from the lowland swamp forests of Canterbury to the coastal plains of Otago. A remarkable mummified neck found in Onslow Cave in 1871, which was preserved through a combination of Otago's dry climate and location of a temperate cave, meaning it was able to be preserved for a remarkable 2,000 years. On one side, the white bones of the vertebrae are exposed, and on the other, the moa's flesh and muscle left mostly intact, along with crispy skin and patches of bristles, which would have been the basis of feathers in life. Hundreds of thousands of these birds have been found throughout moa hunter camps across the South Island, which raises some interesting questions about their social behaviour. Large flightless birds of the open plains tend to be more social than those that dwell in the deep forests. Ostriches can form groups of up to 50 during certain seasons and lay their eggs in communal nests, incubated by several males, while the shy cassowary on the contrary keep to themselves except when mating or defending their territories. The sheer number of eastern moa suggests that they would have encountered each other more often, meaning that they may have even flocked together. Some evidence of communal breeding grounds has been discovered near Lake Grasmere in Marlborough, which was found covered in broken eggshells, suggesting they gathered together to take advantage of the warm sand to incubate their massive eggs. The Upland moa was one of the smallest species of moa, being lightly built and weighing around 30 kilograms. This moa species is uniquely the only member of its family that's being Megalaptorigidae, and through morphological characteristics has been determined to be the most basal of all moa. Upland moa were relatively small and agile, not being as bulky as most members of Imiidae, yet stockier and shorter legged than members of Deinonythidae. Birds were found commonly in the South Island subalpine zones around 2,000 metres above sea level, especially in Nelson, Otago and Fiordland. Birds are further unique in that, unlike other known moa species, upland moa do not pronounce any obvious sexual dimorphism in regard to body size. Their eggs are also a greenish blue, whereas other moa laid white eggs. The beak was particularly elongated and pointed, indicating that they were selective and precise feeders, with coprolites and gizzard contents supporting this, as they show that upland moa fed on a variety of alpine herbs, as well as browsing from shrubs and trees. The presence of parasites that typically affect aquatic or wading birds suggest that upland moa also fed around the margins of alpine lakes where they would have eaten aquatic vegetation. Like other herbivores that inhabit high altitude environments, upland moa would have engaged in altitudinal migrations in response to snowfall and food availability, moving during the autumn and winter months where food was more accessible, and returning to their upland feeding grounds during spring and summer. The feet were also proportionally larger when compared to other moa, with noticeably long and strong toes and thick claws that were adapted for climbing up steep, rocky slopes and for walking across snowy terrain. Unlike other moa which had scaly skin covering, upland moa had feather pits down to the bases of the toes, indicating that the whole leg and much of the foot was feathered, an adaptation seen among other cold-adapted birds such as ptarmigans. The fact that birds displayed little sexual dimorphism also gives some insight into their behaviour, suggesting that ecological segregation among sexes was limited, implying that upland moa were potentially more gregarious than other moa species. The best modern analogue for reconstructing upland moa social behaviour may be the South Island takahe, which, living in the same regions as these birds once did, form family groups consisting of a monogamous breeding pair and their offspring. These birds are most well known for the remarkable mummified remains found over the years, with more of these birds being found mummified than any other moa species, all of which preserving these extinct birds in exquisite detail. Mummified remains show that birds had two types of feathers, with some having a greyish-white base, becoming blacker and ending in a white tip, giving off a mottled effect, with others having a plain or slightly streaky appearance. This mottled plumage covered the whole body, extending to the base of the bill, and as mentioned earlier, covered the lower legs. Articulated skeletal remains with dried soft tissue remains have also been recovered from cave deposits, which among these include a complete head which has preserved the tongue, eyeballs and part of the neck in remarkable detail, as well as complete feet, that have sometimes circulated and spread around the internet as that of a non-avian dinosaur, and even a complete leg that indicated that this individual bird was molting. All of these remarkable mummified remains mean that upland moa are the best known moa species when it comes to their anatomy, and gives us a tantalising glimpse into what once was. Upland moa are rarely found in Maori middens, which suggests they were not hunted nearly as heavily as their lowland relatives. This was due to their colder and more inhospitable habitat, which was typically avoided by Maori due to its treacherous ascent and descent, and lives were often lost when trying to traverse the terrain. As such, it has been suggested that upland moa may have outlived other moa by as much as 100 years, before their generally accepted date of extinction in the 1500s. Moa were extremely successful animals in New Zealand, being the dominant herbivores in their ecosystem for millions of years. That was all until an intelligent group of mammals made their way to and discovered the country, which would be a turn for the worst in the case of the moa, and the end to their Edenic habitat as they knew it. The exact year when New Zealand was first sighted will always remain open to debate, and it is impossible to ascertain through archaeology due to there being no physical evidence. Navigators such as Coupe and other great navigators seldom contain dates, but it is conceivable that the great navigator or someone like him had found New Zealand around 1,000 years ago. The date of which the first settlements arrived in New Zealand, formed when groups of people had arrived and built permanent homes for themselves, is much more clear. The 13th century was a period of great events in human history, with the largest and most powerful cultures on Earth continuing to fight each other for the conquest of new lands, such as Africa and the Far East, along with the peak of the Middle Ages in Europe and the conquest of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. All while this was taking place, a small group of Eastern Polynesian sailors claimed the last major landmass that had yet to be discovered by people. Following the directions from earlier explorers, whole tribes boarded enormous twin-hulled sailing canoes, or waka, which were able to hold up to 100 people at a time, set off into the vastness of the southern Pacific, navigating through the use of stars, tides, and natural rhythms of the ocean, a feat that at the time would have been beyond many other sailors on the planet. Eventually, after weeks of travelling and planning, the first peoples of the world set eyes on what would come to be known as Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. This land was completely different from the tropical atolls that they had left, cold, wet, mountainous, and at the same time rich in forest and resources. Greeting the new colonists would have been a cacophony of birdsong, echoing throughout the forests and coastlines, from the rapid chirps of saddleback, the high-pitched cheeps of the riflemen, and the haunting cries of the kokako, as well as the loud booms of a group of birds they would soon come to rely on, that being the moa. The first encounters with these large birds was likely one of fear, as the largest birds these people would have seen before this time would have been chickens. But this fear would soon be replaced by a feeling of opportunity, and it was quickly realised that moa were plentiful and would be a great source of food. They were quickly and rapidly taken advantage of, with Maori traditions indicating that moa were caught in nooses and snares made out of wood and flax, and while avoiding kicks from their powerful feet, would be knocked to the ground and swiftly killed, which once killed, the parts of the moa would be utilised in many ways. The bones, skin and feathers undoubtedly proved an important industrial resource, in addition to the immediate demands for food. The large leg bones were ideal for the manufacture of fish hooks, chisels and awls, and the feathers would have been made into spectacular cloaks, although few remains are known. Whatever was not useful was thrown away and dumped into middens, essentially underground rubbish dumps, where a great many moa remains have been found. Moa hunting was the prime source of food for the Maori, and for a while there must have seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of moa, but like all of the great animal resources discovered by humans, their relentless exploitation would soon cause moa populations to crash. In Polynesia, bird populations which consisted of seabirds had large enough populations and fast breeding to ensure that populations could recover quickly after each season. But with moa, which were long-lived and slow to breed, each loss critically affected the population of around 2.5 million, as mature breeding females and their nutritious eggs would be the first to be targeted. Over the course of a century, a so-called ecological blitzkrieg took place across the country, with up to 100,000 moa being butchered in one camp alone, making it easily the largest prehistoric killing site in the world. The most commonly hunted species were the eastern moa of the coastal plains, and the stout-legged and heavy-footed moa of the inland hill country, which could be thought of as the commercial species that were hunted in large numbers, and were likely the first species to be entirely wiped out. Giant moa were present in the same environments, but were more elusive and rarer, but even so, they could not hide for long. The much smaller upland and little bush moa appear occasionally in high-altitude oven pits, and would have been the last species to avoid the hunters, with only the elusive crested moa never being found in middens. Within just a couple of generations, moa were extinct over much of New Zealand, and it is fascinating to think that the hunting of these animals didn't take place in a distant and unknowable past, but really quite recently compared to other notable extinctions. The hunting of the moa occurred at a time when the Ming dynasty and Incan empires were thriving, and Gutenberg had invented the printing press, and by the time of their accepted extinction, Michelangelo had begun work on his iconic sculptures of David, and when Richard III reigned over England. The last moa of the once pristine land of New Zealand had been hunted largely into extinction in an unprecedented manner. After their accepted extinction date of around the beginning of the 16th century, could there have been birds that survived past this date? For years after their extinction, there had always been a desire that moa may still exist in the dark forests of New Zealand, and many sightings have been claimed over the years, many of which being ludicrous and hoaxes, but some were most definitely credible ones, and it calls into question whether a few birds may have managed to cling on. There are many sightings that have been considered credible, from gold miners hearing odd sounds in the bush, as well as spotting monstrous birds, to a young girl by the name of Alice Mackenzie encountering and even touching a large bird on the west coast, although not a single one has physical evidence of the birds, and while intriguing, cannot be entirely relied on in determining continued moa survival. Birds most definitely could have survived past the accepted extinction date of most moa populations, as Fiordland, a region 12,000 square kilometres in area, is surrounded by peaks, glacier-carved valleys, and some of the highest rainfall in the world. Many valleys and fjords have never been set foot on by hikers and hunters, and it is extremely unlikely that any Polynesian settlers could have reached them either. Entire parties of people could be killed in these hazardous alpine crossings, so if any moa did survive in these regions, they would have had little to worry from people. A glimmer of hope for any surviving moa came when takahe were rediscovered in the Murchison Mountains in 1948, surviving in a refuge free from predators that has yet to reach their mountainous habitat. Ultimately though, if any moa did survive until this time in some mountainous region, their potential for survival slammed shut when more introduced predators were brought to New Zealand after European arrival. Larger, more aggressive Norwegian rats were introduced, as well as cats, rabbits, pigs, goats, and the most vicious of them all, that being stoats. After their introduction in the late 1800s, they quickly spread throughout the country, wiping out species after species, eventually reaching the remotest corners of Fiordland and eliminating even Kakapo and Piopio out of Resolution Island and surrounding islands. The chance of any surviving moa lasting into European times until the beginning of the 20th century was indeed possible, despite the lack of physical evidence, but with the introduction of more persistent and aggressive predators, it meant that even in these regions, the birds were doomed. Even the takahe strongholds were beginning to be intruded, and only survive today with heightened genetic diversity at the hands of conservationists. Whereas, if any moa did survive, they were likely too far gone and weren't able to be found in time to be saved. The last moa was likely an upland moa, hidden away in a high-altitude sanctuary in the Alps or Fiordland, or even a crested moa or little bush moa, scuttling around an unexplored corner of Fiordland. Whatever the species, the eggs of the last moa, if any breeding females were left, would have been the first to go. Fragile and a massive target for introduced predators, it meant that if any moa population remained, any attempt at raising a next generation would be quickly snuffed out, and after around 50 years, the lifespan of most moa, the last bird would have wandered alone until it too died, unnoticed and unmourned. Despite their extinction, it has been proposed that moa are prime candidates for future cloning of extinct animals, given their recent extinction, and that as so many intact sequences of DNA exist, moa could very well make a return, but it is unknown as to when or if ever this comes to pass, and if it does come to pass, it would bring back a vital part of New Zealand's endemic fauna. Even after their extinction, their impacts on the world around them can still be seen, particularly in the lancewood, which had the most peculiar lifestyle compared to all other forest trees in New Zealand. When a lancewood first sprouts, its small narrow leaves are mottled and drab and not out of the ordinary, but once they begin to grow taller, they begin the first of their radical transformations in shape and colour. The leaves form into a phalanx of metre-long rigid leaves, with barbs surrounding the edges of the leaves. When these trees reach 3 meters tall, they change their shape and colour once again, resembling a more conventional forest tree. Many plant species have adapted to protect themselves against browsing and grazing animals, and this was also the case in New Zealand, where the lancewood in this case had to defend themselves against the moa. Lacking the prehensile tongues of browsing mammals, large herbivorous birds like moa had to approach the leaves head-on, tearing leaves off and then swallowing. The rigid daggers of the juvenile lancewood are therefore perfectly adapted to either poking out the eye or sticking in the gizzard of a grazing moa, even displaying aposematic coloration like wasps or venomous snakes to advertise the danger they possess, the first known example of such a warning in any plant species. All in all, the story of the moa in recent history is a tragic one, with over-exploitation being a central theme. They were hunted, killed, and forgotten about until recently, and it is only now that we can fully appreciate these birds. From a cultural aspect, when Europeans arrived in New Zealand and the birds were rediscovered, they quickly became famous and was key in shaping New Zealand's formative years, being a symbol to the much revered All Blacks and even being featured in the official coat of arms, still being so in Wellington. Much of the information gathered for this video was sourced by the fantastic book Moa, The Life and Death of New Zealand's Legendary Bird by Quinn Berendsen, a book that even I learned some new information on these remarkable birds and their history, also going into depth on multiple sightings that I didn't have the time to cover in this video. And with that, I thank you for watching this instalment of New Zealand Bird of the Week. For next time, you are now able to vote for the fluttering shearwater, a bird that flies in a unique way. And with that, I'll see you next time, whenever that may be.